Okay, let's get a lot more insight into what's going on in Ukraine in the past, in the future. Now, we're joined by Aurel Braun. Aurel is a professor of international relations and political science at the University of Toronto. Aurel, always a pleasure to see you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, before we begin talking about the consequences of all the horrific attacks and fighting, what about the discussion to end the violence? Apparently a fourth round of talks slated for Tuesday, but so far they've been pretty unproductive.
It is always better to have negotiations and diplomacy than war because war is so unpredictable and so tragic. But so far, the discussions that have occurred have not been particularly productive. And many Western leaders, including people like Emmanuel Macron, who has good relations with Vladimir Putin, have been very skeptical about the intentions of the Russian team, whether they are willing to settle. And so it's hard to be optimistic at this point, but perhaps there will be some movement. We have to see what each side is willing to settle for. We have to see what they mean by neutrality.
Yeah, and if either side's willing to compromise, Ukraine's President Zelensky says he would be open to neutrality, but he has demands in return. Do you think that's going to do anything to appease Moscow? And do you see anything to indicate that there's some significant compromise on the horizon?
We have to understand that terms are used differently by various countries. So when we think of neutrality, it could be a country that is neutralized or a country is self-declared neutral, but it is usually an armed neutrality. So if you look at examples such as Sweden or Switzerland, they have very strong armed forces and the capacity to ensure and protect their sovereignty. The sense we get is that this is what President Zelensky is looking at, that yes, he would give up on NATO membership that was not really in the cards, that is willing to compromise, that he would not join any kind of alliance, but he wants to restore sovereignty and he wants to be able to protect that sovereignty. What we get from the Russian side is they still talk about a kind of neutrality that in their view would lead to a disarmed Ukraine that would be vulnerable, that would be a kind of frozen conflict that could be unfrozen. That, especially since President Zelensky is saying would have to be any agreement submitted to a referendum, that is not going to fly.
Yeah, and in this next bit here, we have an update on Russia's threat to unleash a nuclear attack in the area. It says the Kremlin, in short, saying a short time ago that it would only use its nuclear weapons there if, quote, there was a threat to the existence of the country. What does that mean, and how do you interpret all that?
It's very unfortunate because it is a kind of nuclear saber rattling, and it ought to alarm not only opponents but even friends of Russia, because this is the way you can walk yourself into a larger conflict. Deterrence is a very finely tuned instrument. It is a psychological relationship, and by saying, well, if our existence is threatened, is it the existence of Russia as a whole? No one is attacking Russia. Is it the existence of the Russian regime of Vladimir Putin? Well, that is a different kind of a matter because they have engaged in a war where obviously there have been very significant miscalculations. Whatever the Kremlin says, they have not met the military goals that they would have said this was not what they had expected. Right. And consequently, Russia now is subject to increasing sanctions. It's going to have more and more difficult relations. It has become an unreliable partner. And I think it's going to make it difficult in terms of friends because they will be making new demands for getting help from friends.
Aurel, Ukraine also says its country has suffered massive financial losses in a little more than 4 weeks of fighting. It has lost some $564 billion with a B dollars and 1/5 of that in destroyed infrastructure. How much longer can it go on like this? And do you see this country just being completely devastated?
They have suffered enormous devastation, and it is obvious that the people of Ukraine crave for peace. It would be tremendous for the region. But if peace comes, the West has vast resources. They can rebuild Ukraine. Main goal is to save lives. Lost lives cannot be replaced. But at the same time, we have to look at the larger picture. And Russia is suffering devastating economic losses that I do not think they even understand at the moment. There's a shift in energy flows. They're moving away in the West from reliance on Russia. Companies, in terms of investing in Russia, all of these things have a very long and very deleterious long-term impact. And Russia's partners will find that Russia is a much more difficult associate.
Yeah, or I've actually read that it could be set back decades, but we'll have to take that up on another time. But as always, thank you. Aurel Braun, Professor of International Relations and Political Science, University of Toronto.